I pursued him for 5 years without success. After 5 years, I saw him among a group of tall and handsome guys at the KTV. I had been drinking and shamelessly held his hand, saying, "Frank, can you give me a kiss?" He obediently complied. But he hugged and kissed me, yet his eyes held a compassion that I couldn't understand. Chapter 1. After graduating, I became a small wealthy woman. No sugar daddy, no lottery win, and no unexpected windfall. Just on a sunny afternoon, my dad told me expressionlessly, "Actually, you're an heiress." I thought he was joking and was about to laugh when he suddenly threw a stack of property deeds and a bank book at me. Trembling, I opened them and to my surprise, they were all real. I had always thought my family was just a comfortable middle-class family, but it turned out my parents had been keeping their wealth a secret. When I asked why they had hidden it from me for so many years and suddenly revealed it, my dad regretfully said, "Ah, I was drunk that day." Thanks to my parents' financial support, I had no economic pressure and opened a coffee shop that I loved. Life was simple and comfortable until one day, I spent $700 at the KTV and ordered the male god I had been chasing for 5 years but never caught up with. The male god's name was Frank. It was my best friend Lemon's birthday, and a group of us girls got drunk at the KTV. Then, we collectively made a crazy decision. To order a few male models to drink with us. And that's when I saw Frank among the group of male models. After 2 years, he hadn't changed much. His features were still outstanding, and his gaze remained clear. Frank loved wearing white shirts, and he stood out from the crowd with an air of arrogance. Among the 5 of us girls, including myself, 3 of us were drawn to Frank without any prior agreement. But I intercepted them first and said, "Sisters, let me have him." They drunkenly protested, but with just one sentence from me, they all fell silent. "He is Frank." They all froze simultaneously, no longer making a sound, and exchanged looks. I had told them the story of me and Frank more than once. And then I successfully brought Frank back to the couch as I wished. My sisters were loyal and selfless, voluntarily giving us the dimmest and quietest corner. Sitting beside him, I felt my breath becoming difficult, and a heaviness in my chest. I sat up straight. Even though I was the one paying, I couldn't bring myself to say a word. After a while, I softly asked him, "How have you been these past 2 years?" He replied softly, his voice cutting through the music and reaching my ears. With just a simple, he answered me. Afterwards, there was a long and awkward silence, until my girlfriends thought I was too timid, so they ordered a few more rounds of drinks. Frank stayed silent, quietly drinking with me. However, after a few bottles of alcohol, my nerves started to numb. I felt like I could do it again. The timid and fearful me from just a moment ago disappeared instantly. After guzzling down a bottle of beer, I forcefully placed the empty bottle on the coffee table in front of me and turned to look at Frank. He held a bottle of alcohol in his hand, his fingers long and his joints defined. Even his hands were more attractive than those of an average person. I stared at him quietly for a while, and then, under the influence of alcohol, I opened my small bag and took out a stack of money without hesitation, stuffing it into his hand. Then, I looked at the person I had idolized for years and, with slurred speech, said, "Frank, can you kiss me?" Frank looked at me for a moment and suddenly smiled. I rarely saw him smile during all the years of pursuing him. When he smiled, his eyebrows and eyes curved slightly, as if there were scattered starlight within his gaze. In the next moment, he calmly glanced at the money and said, "How about a few more kisses? Otherwise, I might feel uneasy taking this money." As I struggled to regain my senses from his smile, I furrowed my brows with the lingering effects of the alcohol and said, "Don't just talk, why don't you?" However, before I could finish my sentence, Frank really leaned in for a kiss. My mind went blank, and the warm and tender sensation on my lips was something I had never dared to imagine in my dreams for years. Chapter 2. Did Frank really kiss me? My mind went blank. Whether it was out of shyness or not, I tightly gripped the collar of his shirt. In retrospect, I always felt that this action was quite foolish. Especially when Frank let go of me after a moment, he helplessly chuckled. If you keep pulling like that, you're going to choke me to death. I quickly let go of my grip. Looking at the boy in front of me, whom I had regarded as a deity, he was now quietly looking at me with clear eyes, still holding the stack of money I had just stuffed into his clothes. Oh my gods, he seemed to have instantly descended from the heavens and acquired a touch of worldly charm. Of course, I wouldn't despise him for this. On the contrary, my hands, trembling with excitement, were huddled in the sleeves. If he really would stay by my side because of the money, that would be great. Perhaps I was lucky. After opening the cafe, it didn't go bankrupt as my family had expected. On the contrary, it inexplicably became an internet-famous spot, with people coming every day to explore and take photos. Money, I had it. But Frank was the one who was rare and hard to come by. Staring at him for a while, I turned around and picked up the bottle of alcohol beside me. With a gulp, I drank more than half of it, then placed it on the coffee table with a loud thud. Taking a deep breath, I turned to look at him. Frank. He responded, his voice soft, landing in my ears like a feather, light and ticklish. I licked my lips, mustering up courage and asked him, would you come home with me? Frank visibly froze. He frowned, and those deep, beautiful eyes peered at me, but the emotions hidden within his gaze were incomprehensible to me in my intoxicated state. However, my alcohol-numbed brain gradually reacted. I quickly changed my wording and explained, I mean, do you have any difficulties right now? I can help you, really. Frank looked at me silently. For a long time. Then, just as I was about to give up, Frank softly spoke, I need a lot. It's okay. Urgently, I grabbed his hand, emphasizing repeatedly, I can help you, really. All the sadness and longing from those years of unrequited love were unleashed by the alcohol in this moment. I tightly held his hand, looking at him unwaveringly. Frank, please don't be with other women. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to see Frank, who always wore white shirts, sitting or even lying beside other women for money. Whether it was due to my sudden outburst of emotions or not, Frank, who had initially carried a hint of playfulness, also grew increasingly serious. He silently stared at me, his eyes deep and profound. But I felt that within his gaze, there was a faint trace of compassion. Just as I was about to urgently add him on WeChat to transfer the money, Frank held my hand. His palm was warm, and in just a few seconds, the warmth spread to me. Not for now, he said, glancing at the money I had just given him. He spoke softly, let's settle up daily. This money will just be enough for a day. I was taken aback. Frank had just mentioned that he was expensive, but I hadn't expected him to be this expensive. I had given him at least tens of thousands of yuan, but it was only enough to support him for a day. Last time, my best friend said she would take me to open my eyes, and the most expensive male models in the club cost only a few thousand yuan. But I gritted my teeth and agreed anyway. That day, I took Frank home. I was drunk, but he wasn't. My head was spinning from the alcohol, but my courage grew. Under the influence of alcohol, I undressed him in the bedroom. Initially, Frank wanted to refuse, but I held his face in my hands, staring at him earnestly, though it was difficult to focus my gaze on his face. Frank. I slurred, I paid for this. Are you ready to accept my ravaging? Frank froze for 2 seconds, then he laughed. And then, he didn't resist anymore. But I was really drunk, and as I was about to undress him, I suddenly felt a discomfort in my chest. Unable to hold it back, I vomited directly on his pants. And then, I don't remember much after that. In any case, when I woke up the next day, I was in Frank's embrace. I was wearing a nightgown, lying in Frank's arms. The alcohol had mostly worn off, and I cautiously asked him what had happened last night. Frank smiled. He raised an eyebrow, his beautiful eyes looking unreal. Guess? Guess? I pulled back the covers and took a look. Oh no. I was really drunk last night. Silent for a long time as I stared at the red stain on the bedsheet, I pursed my lips and whispered, I will take responsibility for this. Saying that, I hurriedly grabbed my phone, wanting to transfer the money to him right away, but my phone ran out of battery and shut down last night. I awkwardly smiled, holding the phone in my hand. I'll pay you the fee later, okay? Frank paused for a moment, then lowered his gaze. He replied with a soft, After that, we silently got out of bed, got dressed, and no one said a word. However, when Frank got up and dressed, I secretly stole a glance at him. Such a handsome boy, and I had no memory of last night at all. What a waste, getting blackout drunk like that. Chapter 3. As Frank turned around, I quickly averted my gaze and anxiously looked elsewhere. He had put on his clothes but wrapped a towel around his lower body. When he looked back at me, he furrowed his brow slightly and said, "The pants aren't dry." Huh? I glanced at the men's trousers hanging on the balcony. Did you wash the pants last night?
Yeah.
Frank's voice was low. You vomited all over me. Me? I paled as I recalled the events. It was indeed me who vomited. After a moment of silence face to face, I suddenly remembered that I had my brother's pants, brand new. I hastily rummaged through the wardrobe and handed them to Frank. But he didn't immediately take them. He lowered his gaze and looked at them for a moment before raising his eyes to me. You still have men's pants at home? His voice was soft, without any questioning tone, as if he was just casually remarking. Then he took the pants. For some reason, I quickly explained, they belong to my brother. He bought them on his way to my place last time and forgot to take them when he left. Frank didn't react much either. He just took the pants and went to the bathroom. I pursed my lips, feeling embarrassed that I had seen everything a moment ago. I had just changed into clean clothes when I heard Frank's voice coming from the bathroom. Do you have a new toothbrush? Yes. I quickly responded and hurriedly went in. I found a toothbrush for him and I carefully picked up my own dental supplies, standing next to him to brush our teeth together. In the mirror, I was wearing a white dress that matched Frank's white shirt perfectly. We stood side by side, and I only reached up to his chin. But after brushing our teeth, Frank's toothpaste foam was stained with blood. My heart skipped a beat as I looked at it. Frank, you. Frank, however, rinsed his mouth nonchalantly, washed off the foam from the corners of his mouth, and remained calm. It's nothing, just some gum inflammation lately. I could only nod, but I started to doubt. Could it be that Frank, working as a male model at the KTV, had some kind of serious illness like they show on TV? But Frank seemed indifferent, and he didn't appear to have any symptoms. After freshening up, we sat side by side on the edge of the bed, another moment of silence passing between us. He turned to me and whispered, "Can I still go to work?" Work? I hesitated for a moment and tentatively asked, "You mean at the KTV?" Yes. Seeing that I couldn't bring myself to say it, Frank nodded and interrupted me. Don't worry. Without thinking, I unplugged my charging phone, turned it on, and quickly added Frank as a friend before transferring him 10,000 yuan. I've transferred the money to you, don't go spend time with other women anymore. After thinking for a moment, I softened my tone and added, "Is that okay?" Frank looked at me for a while, then lowered his gaze and said calmly, "Okay." During breakfast, I couldn't help but ask him softly, "Frank, why don't you find a different job? How could such an arrogant person willingly engage in this kind of job just to make money?" After I said this, Frank paused with the spoon in his hand and calmly replied, "I need the money." He didn't specify the exact reason, and I didn't dare to ask further. After breakfast, I was about to go to the cafe, but Frank followed closely behind me. When I asked him, he calmly said that since I was financially supporting him, his time belonged to me. Of course, I happily agreed. Inside the cafe, Frank, wearing a clean white shirt, stood by my side at the counter, attracting the attention of the customers. His appearance was immaculate, with pure black eyes. He didn't even need to do anything, just standing there quietly was enough to capture everyone's gaze. Some people are naturally radiant. Since I first saw Frank when we were young, I haven't been amazed by anyone else. During his spare time at work, I would secretly observe him, resting my chin on my hand, and it felt like everything had returned to how it used to be. Speaking of which, I've known Frank for many years. We were high school classmates, and later, we both got into the same university in the city. However, in the second half of our sophomore year, Frank dropped out. Since then, we never heard from him again. No one did. During our school days, Frank was the most prominent figure in the crowd, but people like him are often envied. In high school, there were many rumors about Frank circulating in the school, and they were not pleasant to hear. When Frank's parents passed away during his junior high years, and in the second year of high school, a rumor spread throughout the school that Frank was being financially supported by a woman. A woman who was more than 10 years older than him. Various rumors filled the air, but Frank never explained anything, and gradually, everyone just accepted it as true. In fact, many girls liked Frank, but because of the rumors, everyone kept their distance from him. Only I, stubborn and persistent, braved all the rumors and pursued him for 5 years. From our first year of high school to the end of our sophomore year. I only remember that when I confessed to him in public, the first thing he said to me was, "Little girl, aren't you afraid of those rumors?" Time has passed, and I can't remember many details anymore, but to this day, I still remember how resolute and determined I was when I looked at him. What is there to be afraid of? When you truly like someone, you're not afraid at all. I was so brave and fearless back then. Unlike now, where I have to rely on alcohol to make my intentions known. Thanks to Frank, business has been particularly good today, with mostly female customers. Business may be good, but I'm feeling a bit unhappy. I can't help but feel that my precious one is being noticed by other girls. So, today I closed the shop early and went home with Frank. After all, there are some things more important than running a business, right? But Frank obediently followed me home, but I hesitated. He willingly entered the bedroom with me, but when he sat down by the edge of the bed, quietly looking at me with those clear eyes, I felt guilty. It seemed like all my impure thoughts were tarnishing him. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. After thinking it over, I decided to buy more alcohol to drink. After all, alcohol gives courage, and I needed some courage. Frank was obedient. He brought the alcohol and placed it on the bedroom carpet, then turned and went to the kitchen. I was puzzled. What are you doing? Cooking. He tied an apron around himself, carrying the vegetables he bought while getting the alcohol downstairs, and entered the kitchen. Drinking on an empty stomach is not good for digestion. He added, "Remember to eat on time in the future." His words softened my heart, and I quickly followed him into the kitchen, gathering the courage to ask, "So are you caring about me?" Frank smiled, and his eyes softened with that smile. "You can think of it that way." I smiled along. "Then I'll think of it as him caring about me." Frank was skilled in cooking. I sat on the couch, watching TV, and could hear the sounds coming from the kitchen. Before long, he came out with the dishes. 2 dishes and 1 soup, braised eggplant, garlic stir-fried water spinach, and tomato egg soup. Very ordinary home-cooked dishes, but I couldn't stop eating. Oh, my idol is truly versatile. He's handsome, did well in school, and even cooks so deliciously. After eating my fill, I suddenly remembered the untouched alcohol in the bedroom. After hesitating for a while, I decided to let it go. Never mind, I might end up vomiting if I drink more. After the meal, Frank didn't let me enter the kitchen. He washed the dishes himself, then sat with me on the couch to watch TV. But I couldn't focus on the show. Sitting next to the boy I've liked for so many years, I could hear his breathing, feel his warmth, and even with a glance, I could see the cold curve of his jaw. And the faint movement of his Adam's apple. Any of those things made it impossible for me to remain indifferent. Halfway through the TV show, an unexpected scene of a passionate kiss appeared on the screen. I instantly lost my composure. Seeing the intense kiss between the main characters, I licked my lips and turned to look at him. "Frank, can you kiss me too?" I blushed as I finished that sentence, then mustered up the courage to look at him. Frank paused for a moment, then smiled. He said, "Sure." And then his kiss gently landed on my lips. Frank's kiss was tender, his hands gently cradling my face, his lips softly moving. In that moment, I even had a fleeting thought that I was Frank's precious one, held in the palm of his hand, afraid of being dropped. This kiss deepened gradually. With my eyes closed, I reached out my hand and discreetly pulled at his collar. Chapter 4. Frank's body slightly stiffened, and he held my hand but then quietly let go. I felt nervous. I thought everything would go smoothly tonight, but Frank casually rejected me. On the bed, Frank hugged me while fully clothed. "Sleep," he whispered in my ear, his voice slightly hoarse. I didn't know why there was a hint of heartache in his eyes, nor did I know if he ever had feelings for me. But since he refused, I certainly wouldn't force him. In fact, being held in his arms like this, lightly kissing his lips, was already something I didn't dare to imagine in the past. I nestled in his embrace, gently reaching out to wrap my arms around his waist. "Good night, Frank," I softly called his name, feeling a warmth in my heart. The house was bright and clean, lingering with the aroma of the meal. Being held by Frank, his steady breathing in my ear, I wished for this kind of day to last for hundreds of years. I thought Frank wouldn't respond to me, but a few seconds later, I heard his voice. "Good night, Nan." My name rolled off his tongue, giving me a feeling that easily stirred my heart. I remember when I first met Frank in our freshman year, he asked for my name and then smiled gently, saying, "It sounds nice." That smile when we first met completely captivated me. Lost in my thoughts, I heard Frank's low voice asking, "What are you thinking?" I looked up and coincidentally met his gaze. He chuckled softly, his pure black eyes filled with emotions I couldn't decipher. I smiled at him and said, "I was thinking that the saying is true, that you shouldn't meet someone too stunning when you're young, otherwise, your whole life won't find peace." Frank didn't speak, but after a moment of silence, he tightened his arm around me. And so, Frank and I began our cohabitation life without any clear understanding. My home was in this city, and my parents were often busy with work, never coming to visit me. I never officially introduced Frank to my friends. Firstly, I wasn't actually his girlfriend, so there was no need for introductions. Secondly, to be honest, I had some selfish reasons. Frank was too perfect to me, and I always had the desire to keep him hidden, not wanting others to see him. So, I kept it a secret from everyone and sponsored a Frank with a high price of $10,000 a day. Although I called it sponsorship, in reality, we were no different from any ordinary couple. Except, Frank never touched me. He would hold me to help me fall asleep, he would cradle my face and kiss me, but he never crossed the line. Even once, when I pretended to slip and twist my ankle while taking a shower, he rushed into the bathroom, blushing, and lifted me up. But even then, after placing me on the bed, he quickly left the room after removing his sleepwear. After that incident, I gave up trying. I no longer provoked him. I thought that maybe he didn't love me. Frank, this kind of person, probably had some psychological cleanliness. It would be really difficult for him to touch someone he didn't love. And how could I, who loved him so much, bear to make things difficult for him? Still, I was content to have him by my side. Although I would soon be unable to afford the cost of keeping him. $10,000 a day, the maximum in my savings, could only sustain us for about 10 days. Ironically, it seemed like fate had a hand in this. Perhaps it is destined that on the 10th day of me taking care of Frank, during the night, he suddenly received a phone call. It was around 2:10 in the morning when Frank's phone suddenly rang. His phone is never on silent, as if he's afraid of missing something. The phone rang, and he, who is usually composed, almost sat up abruptly, grabbing the phone next to the pillow. I could barely make out a few words from the phone call, and the only thing I heard clearly was the last sentence, "The situation is not good, come quickly." After hanging up the phone, Frank didn't say a word to me. He quickly got up and got dressed. I had never seen him with such a serious expression. Feeling worried, I asked him softly, "Frank, what happened?" But he remained silent, and I didn't even know if he heard me speaking. Seeing him like this, I couldn't rest assured, so I started getting dressed as well. But Frank dressed quickly, put on his clothes, and left the room directly. "Frank," I called out to him anxiously, quickly putting on my coat and following him outside. At the door, Frank was about to leave, but then he stopped and turned to look at me. Because I was in a hurry, one foot was in a slipper while the other was bare on the floor. Frank whispered, "I have something urgent to attend to, you go back to sleep, don't wait for me tonight." I hurriedly caught up with him, saying, "I don't trust you, can I accompany you? I promise not to cause any trouble." Frank glanced at me, then reached out and ruffled my hair, his voice hoarse, "Put on your shoes, it's chilly at night." I nodded and quickly changed my shoes, following behind Frank as we left. We hailed a taxi, and on the way, I looked at Frank's tense profile, unable to help but recall what just happened. At the door of our apartment, he gently ruffled my hair, and his gaze reminded me of that time in the KTV, gentle and compassionate. Due to Frank's urging, the driver was also driving fast. With fewer cars on the road in the early morning, we quickly arrived at our destination. It was a hospital. The best tumor hospital in our city. I seemed to have guessed something, but Frank has no parents, and I didn't know who else could make him care so much, to the point of becoming a male model to earn money for medication. After getting out of the taxi, Frank almost ran into the hospital, and I hurriedly followed, running along. In front of the emergency room. Frank looked at the lit room, his hands clenched tightly. For some reason, the look in his eyes seemed filled with hope. I stood behind him, watching him, not knowing what he had gone through, and not knowing what kind of experiences had shaped the Frank of today. During this time, we didn't say a word. Actually, I wanted to ask him who was inside, but after hesitating for a while, I ultimately didn't disturb him with my voice. I don't know how much time passed, but the lights in the operating room went out, and a doctor came out. Frank almost ran over in an instant, but the doctor still gave him the answer he least wanted to hear. "Sorry, we did our best. The patient still has some consciousness left. If there's anything you want to say it quickly." Frank stood there in a daze, still only showing me his back. Although he didn't move, his back seemed to bend in an instant. Soon, medical staff pushed a person out, heading into a hospital room. It was a woman, a middle-aged woman. Frank quickly followed inside. They passed by me, and I pursed my lips, carefully examining the woman lying on the stretcher. I had seen this person before. Back then, there were rumors circulating at school, saying that Frank was being kept by an older wealthy woman. The rumors were substantiated and had evidence. I had seen the circulated photos because it involved Frank, so I remembered them particularly clearly. Although the woman lying on the stretcher was pale due to illness, I immediately recognized her. It was her. The woman who was rumored to be Frank's lover, who was more than 10 years older than him. Chapter 5. I can't explain what kind of feeling was in my heart at that moment. It seemed like I had discovered some kind of truth, but this truth was difficult for me to accept. So, everything that Frank did, even sacrificing his dignity to become a male model, was all for this woman who is over 10 years older than him and has no blood relation? I couldn't help but think more. So, the $10,000 support fee I give her every day is also used to pay for her medical treatment, right? At that moment, my heart felt sour and bitter, unable to describe the taste. Outside the hospital room. Because he was in a hurry, Frank didn't close the door. I stood 2 steps away from the room and could see what was happening inside. Frank was half kneeling by the bedside, tightly holding her hand. The Frank who always stood tall even if the sky were to fall was now bending over, trembling slightly. I couldn't see Frank's expression, but I could see the woman's face. She was looking at Frank, whispering something. Frank held her hand tightly, his shoulders slumped heavily. Suddenly, she slowly turned her head and glanced at me. I was stunned, unsure how to react. I just foolishly stared at her until she smiled at me and turned her head back. Frank also glanced at me following her actions, his eyes extremely bloodshot. That middle-aged woman seemed to have truly exhausted her strength. She struggled to say a few words to Frank, but grew weaker and weaker. Until Frank gently leaned over and hugged her. Then he stood up, and the woman seemed to no longer have any movement. Frank knelt by the bed for a long time, then he stood up, tidied up her clothes and bedding, and calmly left the room, calling for a nurse. He didn't say a word to me the whole time. I started to feel a little scared. The person he cared about had passed away, and he no longer had to bend over for medical expenses. Would he also leave me? I dared not think about it. Perhaps due to overwhelming grief, Frank appeared extremely calm after the woman's death. Calm to the point of being somewhat terrifying. I even wished he would kneel there and cry in anguish, as that would be a natural reaction to someone's sorrow. But Frank didn't. He calmly called the nurse, calmly watched the hospital staff take the woman to the hospital morgue, and calmly went home with me to sleep. By the time we arrived home, the sky was already slightly brightening. We lay in bed together, silent. I couldn't hold back and turned my head to ask him softly. So, are you two really in a sibling relationship? I couldn't help but ask, driven by the lingering gaze that the woman gave me. I couldn't put into words that look in her eyes, nor could I forget it. But I didn't expect Frank's reaction to be so intense. He suddenly sat up, looking down at me with a cold expression. Nan, I don't want to hear these words anymore. I had never seen Frank with such a cold face before, and for a moment, I couldn't regain my composure. After a while, Frank seemed to have calmed down. He leaned forward and held me in his arms, his voice softened. Nan, others can doubt me, they can throw dirt at me, but you have to believe me. I nodded, still feeling confused. He only asked me to trust him, without mentioning anything about his past. There wasn't even a word of explanation. But, I have to say, Frank really understands me. He should know that I am the person in this world who will unconditionally believe in him. The next day, Frank held a funeral for her. The cemetery had already been purchased by Frank in advance, and I learned her name from the tombstone, Yvonne. This middle-aged woman seemed to have no relatives or friends, and the funeral was particularly simple. Only Frank wore mourning clothes and accompanied her on her final journey. And of course, me. Throughout the funeral, neither Frank nor I said a word. We calmly and silently bid farewell to this middle-aged woman. After the funeral, Frank and I left. As we walked on the road, the silence persisted, and this silence made me extremely fearful. With no more constraints, no more obligations, was he going to leave me? I didn't dare to ask, afraid that the answer would be something I didn't want to hear. But in the end, Frank took the initiative to speak. Amidst the bustling crowd, he suddenly grabbed my hand. I was taken aback, quickly stopping in my tracks, but kept my head down, unable to look at him. Do you still have money? This was the first question he asked me. I was stunned, quickly biting my lip and saying, yes, I do. But, considering my current predicament, I still asked, can you lower the price now? Frank suddenly smiled. It was a gentle smile, soundless, with a slight curve in his eyebrows and eyes filled with laughter. He said, all right. $1 a day, can you afford it? I was stunned for a long time, then quickly nodded and said, yes, I can. Then, when I mentioned the phrase, lifetime VIP, Frank paused for a moment, and there was an emotion in his eyes that I couldn't understand. Still smiling, he gently held my hand and said, all right. A light breeze blew on the street, bringing a hint of coldness. He held my hand and gently caressed it, saying, let's go home. After speaking, he held my hand and put it in his coat pocket. I followed his footsteps in a daze. Actually, I had never imagined that one day I would hear him say these words to me. Let's go home. In his pocket, I gently held his hand back. All right, let's go home, together. That night, Frank and I both drank alcohol. The room was filled with the smell of alcohol, and empty bottles were scattered on the floor. Frank rubbed his forehead and said in a low voice, I have a bit of a headache. Let's go inside and sleep. I'll clean up the room tomorrow. Okay. Of course, I wouldn't refuse him, not for anything. We lay side by side on the bed, him in his shirt and pants, and me in a cotton suspender nightgown. After a while, I felt that this position was too distant, so I lifted his arm and rolled into his embrace. After spending these days together, we had become closer. And now, having had some drinks, I felt bold enough to make even bolder moves. I wanted to get closer to him, but he started telling me his secret, about his past, and about the middle-aged woman named Yvonne. This was the first time I saw Frank smoking. He sat up, one arm around me, and with the other hand, he took out a cigarette and a lighter from the bedside table, lit it, and took a puff. "Nan, all those rumors are bullshit," he said, surprising me as I looked up and saw a completely different Frank. Having known him for years, he had always been arrogant, cold, and not one to speak much. This was the first time I saw him smoking and cursing, but this version of Frank somehow felt more real to me. He took another drag from the cigarette, turned to look at me, and the smoke lingered between us, blurring his features. Yvonne was never some lover who was 10 years older than me. She was my second mother. He trembled and spoke in a deep voice, then proceeded to tell me a long and profound story. When he was in middle school, his parents died in an accident, leaving him an orphan. The inheritance left by his parents was divided among relatives, and he ended up on the streets, homeless. At that time, it was Yvonne who took him in. They were actually strangers, but Yvonne knew his father. Yvonne's profession was one that is difficult to talk about, the kind that involved earning money from men. She had lived a lonely life, without children or family, without friends. After taking Frank in, she changed her job and stopped earning that dirty money because she said that since she had picked up a son, she couldn't let him hold his head down in shame. Over the years, Yvonne had saved up some money, but she didn't dare to spend it because she wanted to keep it for Frank's education. As he reached this point, the cigarette had burned out. Frank turned to look at me, his eyes bloodshot, and asked, "Are you also wondering why she took me in and sacrificed so much for me?" I nodded truthfully. Especially with those rumors circulating, I couldn't help but wonder. Frank pursed his lips and smiled. Actually, Yvonne was a rather foolish woman. She loved a man for many years, loved him honestly and quietly, without disturbing him or asking for anything in return. She just silently loved him. Suddenly, it all made sense to me. Frank chuckled lightly. "She told me why she did this. When she was young, my dad had a business failure, and he was lost and on the verge of suicide. She felt sorry for him, but she was an orphan herself. In order to help him, she went into that line of work. But when she took her hard-earned money to give it to my dad, she found out that he had already gotten married. My dad and my mom had a hasty marriage. My mom was attracted to my dad's looks, and my dad was attracted to my mom's family's money and influence. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So she was involved with your dad?" Frank extinguished the cigarette and shook his head. "It was always unrequited love. That's why I say she was foolish." Frank hesitated for a moment, then lit another cigarette. In the swirling smoke, he squinted his eyes, as if reminiscing about the past. "When she brought me home, she told me that the decision to take me in wasn't solely because of my dad. She said that she had an accident once and became pregnant with a client's child. She had intended to keep the baby, but due to an unexpected incident, she had a miscarriage. It was a boy." Frank furrowed his brow slightly. "She said that when she saw me on the streets, she couldn't help but think that if her child had been born, they wouldn't be much younger than me. If it were her child who ended up on the streets, she would have been heartbroken. But..." Frank looked up at me, his eyes red, and it pained me to see him like that. "Nan, do you think she was always waiting for me to call her a mom? When I held her for the last time, I whispered mama softly, but I don't know if she heard me." Frank pursed his lips. "This woman has been foolish her whole life. She never received a gentle word from my dad, nor did she get to hear me call her a mom." He crushed the half-burnt cigarette and turned away, truly foolish. Chapter 6. To be honest, I'm at a loss for words and don't know what to say. In short, what Frank just described were the experiences of his entire youth. I feel a mix of heartache and guilt for my previous doubts and suspicions. I don't know how to comfort him, so I simply turn and embrace him, whispering softly, "She heard you, she definitely heard you." Frank nods without saying a word. That night, we talked a lot, about the past, about our thoughts and feelings. However, Frank never mentioned anything about the future. Perhaps it was the effect of alcohol, or maybe after exposing the wounds of his heart to someone, there is a certain sense of indulgence in letting go. I don't know who initiated it, but we slowly drew closer and kissed. We seemed different tonight, both of my hands gently resting on his chest, fingertips tightening and loosening, just like my heart. Tonight, Frank also seemed somewhat different from before. I closed my eyes and deepened the kiss. I thought he would understand what I meant, but when it reached the point of undressing, he still rejected me. He took a deep breath, retracting his hand, his voice low, "Nan, we can't." "Why?" I opened my eyes and looked at him, genuinely disappointed this time. "Frank, it's not like this is the first time. The first night I brought you home, didn't we also end up together? Just now, neither of us intended for anything to happen, it all just naturally unfolded. Why can't we?" But Frank remained silent. He stayed quiet, helping me adjust my shoulder strap, his fingertips unintentionally brushing against my shoulder, radiating warmth. "Frank, what are you really avoiding? I don't believe that you didn't feel something for me just now," I insisted. He did feel something, we were so close just moments ago, and I could clearly see a hint of affection in his eyes. He pulled me into his embrace, resting his chin on top of my head, sighing softly. "I'm sorry, Nan, we can't." Once again, a simple can't. He knows he has me wrapped around his finger, which is why he can so brazenly reject me. I nestled in his arms, silent for a long time. Eventually, I sighed, mimicking his actions, and muttered against his chest, "If you say we can't, then we can't. I'm not some wild beast, nor do I need to devour him." That night, we fell asleep in each other's arms. Strangely, even though I was so close to him, with his heartbeat echoing in my ears, I inexplicably felt that he was drifting further away from me. "Frank," as I was drifting off to sleep, I asked him drowsily, "Are you hiding something from me?" I had a sense that he was keeping something from me, not just about the incident with Yvonne. Frank didn't answer me for a long time. Just as I was about to fall asleep, his voice, barely audible, spoke in a hushed tone, so low that it felt like everything was just a figment of my imagination. "Nan, if I say yes, please don't blame me, okay?" I wanted to say, "No, it's not okay, so don't keep anything from me," but sleep overtook me, and I couldn't open my eyes. I didn't say a word, and drifted off. The next day, I woke up in Frank's arms. It was already past 9 o'clock, and Frank, unusually, had slept in. The forgotten curtains allowed the sunlight to stream into the room, casting a glow on Frank's face, making me a bit dazzled. After knowing him for so many years, I still couldn't help but marvel at his beauty on this ordinary morning. Before meeting Frank, I had never imagined that there could be such a handsome boy in this world. He was cool and arrogant, unaffected by the rumors and gossip, always dressed in white, with a straight posture that stood out from the crowd, shining like a lone crane. Snapping back to reality, I noticed that Frank was already awake. He looked at me with a smile in his eyes, and in that moment of eye contact, Frank leaned in and gently kissed my lips. Perhaps still half asleep, my mind went blank, and I touched my own lips, asking inexplicably, "Frank, is this part of your job?" Frank also froze. After a brief silence, he smiled, sat up, and said, "You can think of it that way." Another ambiguous response. But after spending this time together, I've grown accustomed to Frank's attitude and have stopped pondering over such things. I'm someone who is easygoing, so why bother thinking so much? Besides, he is here with me now. Compared to the 5 years of unrequited love in the past, at least now I can kiss and hug him, and even flirt with him as I please. He has become a presence that I never dared to imagine before. Nestled in Frank's embrace, I whispered a couple of cheesy morning words before reluctantly getting out of bed. At this time, the waitstaff in the restaurant had already opened for business, so I didn't have to rush over. As we got ready in the bathroom together, I suddenly noticed that Frank's face was unnaturally pale in the mirror. "Frank." I held my toothbrush closer to get a better look at him. "Why don't you look too good?" Frank hesitated for a moment and said, "It's nothing, probably just the lighting." I nodded and continued brushing my teeth, but I couldn't help but notice that Frank seemed to have lost weight recently. "Frank," I said with my toothbrush in my mouth, gesturing with my hand to compare the thickness of his arm. "You've lost weight again. You need to eat properly." As I spoke, I rinsed the toothpaste foam from my mouth and discreetly pinched his face. "You're too thin, it doesn't look healthy. You should gain some weight to look handsome." Frank smiled and said, "All right." Breakfast was still prepared by Frank: toast, fried eggs, and 2 cups of warm milk. To ensure that I didn't feel left out, Frank also fried 2 pieces of black pepper sausages. Perhaps to prevent me from worrying, Frank ate a lot today, finishing the remaining half of my fried egg as well. I stared at him blankly, feeling like everything was a dream. I had never imagined that one day, Frank would act like a responsible boyfriend, without any complaints, diligently cleaning up my leftovers. However, after finishing the meal, when Frank went to wash the dishes as usual, he suddenly covered his mouth and ran into the bathroom. He didn't have time to close the door, and I quickly followed him in.
Ugh.
It was the sound of him vomiting. My heart ached, and I hurried over to pat his back, but before I could steady myself, Frank pushed my hand away. He eased up a bit and whispered, "Go outside and wait for me." "It's all right, I can. I don't mind being with you." But before I could finish my sentence, he interrupted, "Go outside." I had no choice but to leave the bathroom. I poured a glass of warm water for him and stood at the door, waiting. After a while, I heard the sound of the toilet flushing, followed by the sound of running water. He must have turned on the faucet to wash up. When he came out again, Frank had washed his face, with water droplets still glistening on his face, and his complexion was still somewhat pale. I handed him the water and worriedly said, "Are you feeling unwell lately? Let's not go to the store today, let's go to the hospital for a checkup." "No need," Frank took the water and took a sip, smiling at me. "Don't worry, it's nothing serious. I just have a slight stomach bug. I'll go to the pharmacy and get some medicine later." "Really? Why would I lie to you?" He drank the water calmly, then went back to the kitchen to continue washing the dishes. Seeing that he didn't show any other signs of discomfort, I felt relieved. I have a weakness for indulging in food and often experience stomachaches and diarrhea, so I didn't pay too much attention to these symptoms. After Frank finished washing the dishes, we went to the coffee shop together. Thanks to Frank, my previously popular shop became even more popular. Customers who came to drink coffee secretly recorded videos of Frank. In this society where looks matter, Frank quickly became popular with his exceptionally attractive appearance. There were countless girls who came for him. I felt a bit uneasy, but also secretly proud. I couldn't suppress that childish thought. Look, the boy I like is so wonderful that so many girls are drawn to him. Of course, that includes me. I think I will always be the girl who loves Frank the most, with all my heart and soul. During this time, Frank has been getting more and more gentle with me. Gentle Frank, it's really too much to handle. I couldn't help but sink deeper and deeper. I couldn't resist asking him, "Frank, have you ever felt attracted to me? Frank, let's not talk about benefits anymore. Can we be serious and be together? Frank, do you also have a little bit of liking for me, right?" But he never gives a direct answer. Every time, he just smiles softly, tousles my hair, and remains silent. He knows me too well, and I always hesitate to press him, so even though he avoids these questions openly, I still can't bring myself to dig deeper and ask him. Every time, I have to give up. But Frank clearly makes me feel that he has also liked me. For example, in this leaf-strewn autumn, he would give me his coat on a windy street, then hold my hand in his palm and take me for a walk along the sidewalk. For example, when I casually mentioned wanting to try a new dessert shop, Frank made an excuse and went out, waiting in line for an hour, buying all their new products for me. And another example, I accidentally discovered that the wallpaper on Frank's phone was a photo of us. It was a picture of us kissing. One time, on a whim, I used the delayed capture mode to capture the moment when Frank and I kissed. That photo is also very dear to my heart. It was taken during the sunset hour, with the golden light casting its glow around us, giving us a layer of gentle golden radiance. It was unbelievably beautiful. And also, every time Frank and I kiss, he is especially serious and devout. He always likes to gently cup my face and then lightly brush his lips against mine. Every kiss makes me feel cherished. But just when I thought Frank was gradually falling in love with me, fate played a joke on me. On a crisp morning at the end of autumn, when I woke up, I found Frank collapsed on the floor. My heart clenched in that moment, a mixture of nervousness and worry, and I could barely breathe. My mind went blank. I didn't even know how I managed to dial the emergency number. All I knew was that as I rushed him to the hospital in a daze, after the examination, I received the devastating news that he was in the advanced stages of stomach cancer, and my world crumbled. I couldn't believe it. That boy, as pure and proud as a swan, that boy who embodied all the beauty in the world, why would he be given a death sentence by the doctors? But Frank had known about his condition long ago. So when he woke up in the hospital room, he just stared at me for a few seconds and smiled. He raised his hand, wiped away the tears from the corner of my eye, his smile still so gentle. Did I scare you? Chapter 7. Scared you, didn't I? Every word in this sentence makes me want to cry. So, he actually knew about his illness a long time ago. The pale complexion, bleeding gums, and vomiting were not just minor ailments. That's why he never talked about the future with me, and he never made any promises. So, back then, at the KTV, when I offered to support him financially, his gaze towards me was gentle and compassionate. He knew everything from the beginning. I don't know if he ever loved me, but if he did, I can't imagine how he felt all this time. I silently watched him, lying pale-faced in the hospital bed, his skin almost translucent. After a brief moment of eye contact, Frank suddenly smiled. Actually, I wanted to keep it from you and quietly leave when I couldn't bear it anymore. But my body failed me, and I fainted unexpectedly. It was better when he didn't speak. As soon as he opened his mouth, my tears flowed even more fiercely. So, why didn't you say earlier? Why didn't you seek treatment? I held his hand, and with each word I asked, my voice trembled. Frank, as usual, reached out and gently ruffled my hair, his voice soft. It's useless, Nan. Even if I sought treatment, it would only be a waste of money. Besides, he chuckled. I'm broke, and I never planned to seek treatment in the first place. Yes, from beginning to end, he didn't have any intention of treating his illness. He lay there, looking at me, his eyes gradually turning red. The biggest regret I have during this time is saying yes to you at the KTV. I was stunned. Why? His fingertips trembled as he continued to gently ruffle my hair, making it even messier. Because I spent your money and couldn't be with you for long. I understand how you feel, but I just couldn't reciprocate. He sighed, his tone low. I'm actually a scumbag. I spent your money and couldn't leave anything for you, Nan. If I could do it all over again, I would never have agreed at the KTV. He seemed unable to hold back anymore, tears welling up in his eyes, but he turned his head away, refusing to let the tears fall in front of me. It's indescribable how heartbreaking that moment was. I had never seen Frank cry, not even at Yvonne's funeral. But now, from my perspective, I could see him turn his head, tears streaming down heavily. Each drop landed with a resounding thud in my heart. I stared blankly at his profile. Oh deities, he seemed like he no longer belonged in this world. The thought made my heart ache unbearably. On the third day of his hospitalization, Frank asked to be discharged and go home with me. Actually, Frank didn't know that I had already started preparing to sell our house and store to treat him. I couldn't persuade him, so I quietly went to find his attending physician. Doctor, please tell me the truth. What are Frank's chances of recovery? I had made up my mind, even if there was a 1% chance, I would save him. But in the privacy of the office, the doctor looked at me, shook his head, and sighed. I've heard about Frank's situation, and he's a pitiful child. To be honest with you, it's already too late. The cancer has spread throughout his body, and no matter how we treat it, it won't make a difference. Continuing treatment would only be torture. It's better to let him spend his remaining days happily. I was stunned for a long time. The doctor's words meant that there was no hope for Frank's treatment. In the end, with tears in my eyes, I left the office and went back to the hospital room to pack Frank's things and take him home. On the hospital bed, Frank looked at me quietly, then held my hand. "Let's go home." I suppressed the bitterness in my heart. "Okay, let's go home." Frank and I took a taxi back home. When we got out of the car, he stubbornly snatched the bag from my hand. "I can still move, there's no reason for a girl to carry things." I didn't argue with him anymore and let him take the bag with his other hand, while he held my hand with his right hand. In fact, these past few days, I've wanted to ask him more than once if he had ever developed feelings for me during this time. But in the end, everything came to naught. Forget it, whether there was love or not, whether our hearts were moved or not, what difference does it make? In the end, it all ends with separation. If there was love, it would probably only make me more heartbroken. Back at home, Frank put down the bags and turned to look at me. Honestly, I was a bit afraid to meet his gaze. But he gently held my face with both hands, forcing me to look up at him. Frank was usually gentle, and it was rare for him to make such a dominant move. But in that moment when our eyes met, I inexplicably started crying. I wanted to hold back, but looking at Frank's face so close to mine, the tears fell more and more fiercely, and I couldn't stop them. After looking at me for a couple of seconds, Frank let out a sigh and gently wiped away my tears with his fingertips, then leaned down and kissed me. It was an incredibly tender kiss. I trembled, my mind went blank, and I couldn't do anything except lightly embrace his neck, gradually deepening the kiss. But in the end, nothing more happened between us. Frank said, "Let's have another drink." Instinctively, I refused. "No, the doctor said you." He looked at me quietly, "It's okay. In these final days, I want to indulge a bit. I've restrained myself my whole life, always wanting to let loose a bit in the end." That phrase, "my whole life," really struck a chord with me. He was only in his 20s, yet it felt like it had already been his whole life. Of course, I couldn't refuse such a request from Frank. In the end, I agreed, but made him promise 3 rules: we could only drink 2 cans of beer. He chuckled and agreed. So, we changed into warmer clothes and went out together, ready to go to the supermarket to buy groceries and alcohol. It seemed like it was the first time Frank and I went to the supermarket together. We walked hand in hand like any ordinary couple, pushing the shopping cart together, stopping in front of shelves to pick. "This vegetable isn't fresh, that meat is too expensive." We picked a cart full of items together, including meat, vegetables, snacks, and some cute and lovely home decorations. Like those adorable bird-shaped toothpick holders, where you press a button and the bird bends down to pick up a toothpick. Or those light blue dried flowers and beautiful glass vases, looking warm and lovely, just like Frank. At the checkout, Frank insisted on paying first. After paying, he took the 2 heavy shopping bags and left, turning back to smile at me. "We've been together for so many days, and I haven't bought you anything. I can still afford a few $100. I forced a smile and followed him obediently. But I realized that many times, Frank was just putting up a front, pretending to be strong. From getting out of the taxi to entering my house, a short 5-minute journey, Frank had to rest 4 times. Illness struck like a collapsing mountain. Before, Frank could pretend to be unaffected and accompany me to work at the cafe, but now, his stamina seemed to plummet instantly. I tried several times to take the shopping bags from his hands, but he refused. Frank looked at me with that familiar gaze and chuckled, "Don't worry, I would feel useless if you did that." In the end, he carried the 2 full bags of groceries back home. In the kitchen, we washed vegetables and cooked together. I could cook, but my culinary skills were average at best. The dishes I made were just edible. But Frank was an excellent cook, so he took charge while I assisted. We laughed and joked, filling the kitchen with laughter and the scent of cooking. As Frank stir-fried the vegetables, I washed the other ingredients, gazing at his back. Could we have more days like this, spending time together with Frank? I don't ask for 10 or 100 years, even just 1 more year, 1 more day would be enough. I realized I couldn't bring myself to think about Frank's illness. Every time I did, tears would flow uncontrollably. He was cooking, and tears were already streaming down my face behind him. After finishing a dish, Frank turned off the stove. Before he could turn around, I quickly turned away, using the sound of running water to mask my stifled sobs. This meal was actually the most difficult one I had ever eaten in my life. I couldn't genuinely smile. Looking at the young man in front of me wearing a white shirt, one thought filled my mind. How could such a wonderful person be sentenced to death? How could? But I dare not show my sadness. I'm afraid it would only make Frank feel worse. Actually, just like the doctor said, every day from now on is a countdown for Frank. I have to make him smile. However, my tightly wound emotions instantly crumbled because of his words. While we were eating, he peeled many shrimp for me and then pushed the bowl filled with shrimp towards me, his voice gentle. Even when I'm no longer here, remember to eat on time. I couldn't hold back. Tears fell heavily, but I didn't dare to lift my head. Instead, I used chopsticks to forcefully scoop rice into my mouth, swallowing it in large mouthfuls. The rice, mixed with tears, tasted bitter. That was the most unforgettable day of my life. Frank and I went to the supermarket together, bought groceries together, cooked together at home, ate together, and drank together. I drank a lot. I remember that after getting drunk, I hugged Frank and kissed him many, many times. I asked him, Frank, has any other girl kissed you like I have? Frank smiled and kissed me, saying, only you. I remember the beautiful sunset that day, and the starry night was beautiful too. I drank too much alcohol, and I can't quite remember what happened afterward. I only vaguely remember that when I was drifting off, with my consciousness hazy, I heard Frank's voice. Nan, I'm sorry, I've never given you anything in return. I'm sorry, but we share the same feelings. I am sorry, it's time for us to say
Goodbye.
He seemed to have said more, but I can't remember. The alcohol clouded my mind, and I fell into a deep sleep. However, when I woke up, it was already too late. Frank was gone. When I woke up, it was the next morning. I walked barefoot around the room, but I couldn't find Frank anywhere. Only on the dining table, there was a letter left by Frank. At the moment I saw the letter, my heart sank, and a sense of foreboding washed over me. And it turned out to be true. Trembling, I opened the letter and glanced at it, noticing the signature in the bottom right corner. Frank's final words. My hand trembled, and the letter fell onto the table, stark against the white surface. I had considered that Frank would be tormented by illness and that one day he would be taken away by it, but I never expected him to leave this world so soon and so willingly. I hadn't read the contents of the letter yet when I received a phone call. Chapter 8. The call was from the police. They said that Frank's body was found in a corner of the nearby park. He had taken a large dose of sleeping pills, and in Frank's phone, there was only my phone number. After hanging up the phone, I numbly kept the letter and then walked out of the door barefoot, forgetting to even put on shoes. But as I closed the door, standing barefoot in the empty hallway, I suddenly couldn't control myself and burst into uncontrollable wailing. What saddened me the most was not Frank's death. I think I understood him. Rather than being tormented by illness and dying, it was better to choose a sunny day, quietly and willingly bid farewell to this world. But what broke me was that even in his final act of suicide, he chose a desolate corner where no one was around. He had no home. He had sold his and Yvonne's former residence to pay for Yvonne's treatment. Even in his last moment in this world, he had nowhere to go. How did I fall in love with such a fool? His goodness was almost unbelievable, and until his final moments, he maintained his kindness and dignity. He didn't choose to end his life in a hotel or leave from my house. He had nowhere to go, so he chose to go to the empty park in the early hours of the morning, find a neglected corner, take sleeping pills, and quietly depart. I can't accept it. I really can't accept it. I crouched in the hallway crying for a long time. Even the neighbor across the hall opened their door to look at me. I seemed to have disturbed them, and I felt sorry, but I really couldn't control my emotions. I don't know how long I cried until I seemed to hear Frank's voice. He said, "Nan, you don't look good when you cry." I abruptly looked up, hoping that it was all just a farce, but the hallway was empty, there was no sign of Frank. But I could clearly feel that Frank was there. He seemed to be watching me from some corner, his gaze gentle. Taking a deep breath, I leaned against the wall and stood up. I knew I had to take care of things after Frank's passing. In this world, he only had me. I went to the police station and saw Frank. He lay there, wearing a white shirt, buttoned up meticulously, with his sleeves slightly rolled up. His face was so peaceful, without a trace of suffering from illness. Even his lips had a faint upward curve. But he was so cruel. How could he bear to leave me alone at home, letting me immerse myself in the dream of having him last night, and then silently leaving this world on his own? We didn't even have a proper
goodbye.
The boy I had liked for so many years, our final parting was his unilateral farewell. He was the most gentle and beautiful, yet also the cruelest existence in this world. That night, I locked myself in the room, trembling, and once again opened that letter. The letter was long, 3 pages in total. It was Frank's familiar handwriting, but every word, every sentence shattered my heart. "Nan, I'm sorry to say
goodbye
to you in this way. There are so many things I want to say, but I don't know where to start. I'm sorry, but in reality, I am a very timid person inside. I can't bear your wonderful affection because of my timidity, insecurity, fear of burdening you, and many other reasons. I couldn't respond to your affection when we were in school. But, to me, you've always been special, the most special among all the people I've met. Nan, it has never been unrequited love for you. I like you more than anyone else, but I dare not say it. You excel academically and are the cherished little princess of your family. But I am just an orphan, an outcast at school, where rumors about me spread far and wide. Even the money I use for school is earned by that woman who has no blood relation to me in exchange for her body. Countless times, I wanted to walk up to you and tell you that I also like you. But every time I looked into your eyes, I couldn't utter a single word. Perhaps you don't know, but you have a pair of exceptionally pure eyes. I believe it's because you were well protected by your family since childhood, which gives you such clear gaze. I thought that everything would be better after getting into university, but the rumors continued to circulate, and Yvonne was diagnosed with a terminal illness. That's why in my sophomore year, I gave up on my studies and started working everywhere to earn money for her treatment. After she took care of me for so many years, it was time for me to repay her. So, I cut off all contact with you. I didn't want to burden you. I have always been following you. I created a fake account to follow your Weibo, secretly observing your life. I knew you won first prize in a competition, that you interned, graduated, and even opened a cafe later on. I am happy for you, and I am glad that the girl I like is doing well. However, during this time, I was diagnosed with stomach cancer. Due to the delay, it was already in the advanced stage when it was detected. The doctor said that the cancer cells had spread rapidly. I started to believe in fate. I realized that no matter how hard I tried in life, fate never treated me kindly. It never gave me any hope, but I thought that if I could cure Yvonne, it would fulfill one of my wishes. I wanted to work multiple jobs again, like before, to earn as much money as possible. But my body wouldn't allow it. My health condition is not good. To save her, I chose to work at a KTV, just as you saw. But Nan, I truly believe in fate because it was really my first day of work when I met you, in such a desperate situation. Besides fate, I can't explain this coincidence. That day, and it's the day I regret the most. Before entering the private room that day, I had some drinks, feeling impulsive. I knew that my life was nearing its end, but I couldn't resist getting close to you, kissing you, and even agreeing to go home with you. Using your money is the most shameful thing for me. But Nan, when I saw you that day, I was truly shaken. I thought, maybe God is pitying me and allowing me to get a little closer to my dream in the final days of my life. You were drunk that day, but in reality, I didn't touch you. How could I bear to? I can see the end of my life at a glance, but you still have a long, long way to go. In the future, you will meet someone who loves you, a gentle boy, and you will fall in love and get married. How could I dare to delay you with my sickly body? The blood on the bedsheet was from my finger, which I cut, thinking that when you woke up, you would blame me for taking advantage of you in a vulnerable state and would kick me out. So, I left decisively. But you didn't blame me at all. In the following days, it felt like stolen time for me. Every minute, every second, every intimate kiss, I cherished it even more. In fact, you don't know. Every day I spent with you, I treated it as if it were the last day. But Yvonne's departure really hit me hard. I've experienced several separations and farewells in my life, so I understand this pain. I started to think, what would you do if one day I left? Would you be sad? Would you secretly cry? Would you stop eating on time? Would you never meet someone who treats you kindly again? I couldn't rest assured, but I know that leaving is just a matter of time. Especially later on, my body couldn't hold on anymore. Many times, I had to endure the pain. Do you remember when I vomited in the bathroom? I pushed you away that time, my attitude was harsh. I'm sorry, but I was afraid that you would be frightened by the blood in the toilet. Nan, forgive my selfishness. I didn't want you to see the wretched state I was in, tormented by illness. I hope that in your memories, Frank will always be the boy who liked wearing white shirts, had short black hair, and smiled gently at you. Forgive my cowardice. I can only leave quietly while you are asleep. I can't face you and say
Goodbye.
in person because I'm afraid I won't be able to bear it. When you read this letter, I will have already left. Don't cry for now. Believe me, I left happily, truly. Because it was the happiest day of my life in this lifetime. The girl I secretly liked and I went shopping at the supermarket. We cooked together, ate and drank together, and we even kissed. I was truly happy. I walked so far to end it all, just so I wouldn't bring trouble to you, to anyone. Nan, as you know, I have no family, no friends. The only person I truly care about in this world is you. So please, don't let my departure unsettle you. I won't say those insincere words to make you forget me, but I hope that when you think of me, it will be memories of our happy times together. I hope that the memories I leave behind in this world won't be filled with pain. I also hope that my leaving won't take away your ability to love. You are still young, and in the future, you will definitely meet someone even better. If that happens, please don't reject them because of me. If that day comes, I hope you keep me in your memories and love someone else wholeheartedly. Rather than you forgetting me, I am more afraid that you will hinder yourself by remembering me. Frank's final words. The letter was long, and I read every word. Strangely enough, as I read Frank's heartfelt words, not a single tear fell from my eyes. I read it with a smile, just as Frank left with a smile. Perhaps Frank didn't know that his departure wouldn't take away my ability to love. On the contrary, because of him, I will understand how to love every person in this world. Having loved someone so tenderly and beautifully, the rest of my journey in life will be healed by him. I smiled as I tucked away the letter and glanced out the window. The moon hung high in the sky, just like Frank's eyes. Frank, I will remember you, and I will love someone else wholeheartedly in the future. But even though I was smiling, tears still escaped my eyes. I must have accidentally opened the window, and the wind carried sand into my eyes. Extra. Chapter 1. Tonight, after having a few drinks, I had an extra strong desire to make a move on Frank. Frank, my male roommate with perfect looks, a gentle personality, and overall great qualities. The only problem was that he was hard to figure out. Under the influence of alcohol, I began to secretly execute my plan on this night. I employed the 36th strategy to capture Frank, lure the snake out of its hole. At around 11 o'clock at night, I intentionally connected Frank's Bluetooth headphones to my phone and started playing a horror movie. I started from the scariest part, ensuring the sound effects were absolutely intense. And then, from the next room, I heard Frank's startled cry. Not long after, there was a knock on my door, and Frank's voice came from outside. I can't sleep alone, can you let me stay for the night? The snake had taken the bait. I lifted the covers and got out of bed, wearing my black lace suspender nightgown and barefoot, as I walked to open the door. Chapter 2. The door opened. Frank stood at the doorway, holding his blanket. His pitiful expression froze the moment he saw me. I purposely straightened my chest and asked, "Is there something wrong?" Even from a step away, I could clearly feel Frank's breathing becoming heavier. And no. Nothing. He was the type of guy who was exceptionally pure, 100% innocent. I was just wearing a low-cut lace suspender dress, and his face turned completely red. I mean, really red. From my perspective, I could even see his ears turning crimson. You change your clothes first, then I'll come in." Saying that, he gentlemanly averted his gaze and prepared to leave, still holding onto his blanket. Of course, I had to stop him. "What's the matter with changing?" I mockingly teased, "This is just a regular nightgown, don't be so old-fashioned, okay?" As I spoke, I purposely scared him, looking at him with a frightened expression. "Frank, behind you." Sure enough, he fell for it, swiftly running past me with his blanket and into the room. Chapter 3. I turned around and smiled at Frank, then slowly closed the door. The night was long, and I wondered how to proceed. But as I turned, I noticed Frank standing by the bed, still holding his blanket, his fair and handsome face filled with confusion. "Frank, why is your face so red?" I playfully teased him, walking over and tugging at his sleeve. He was wearing a set of cotton pajamas, pure white in color. It was rare to see a guy who liked white so much. Throughout the year, most of his clothes were probably white. As I asked him, Frank's face seemed to grow even redder. He glanced at me quickly, changing the subject. "Are you watching a horror movie?"
Yeah.
I pretended not to understand. "What's wrong?" "You even used my headphones by mistake." He looked innocent. "Oh dear," I acted surprised and apologetic. I was wondering why the headphones weren't working. "I'm really sorry if I scared you." Frank fell silent for a moment. "It's okay." I hugged my iPad and smiled at him. The screen still displayed the ferocious face of a female ghost. "Well, how about we get on the bed and watch together?" Chapter 4. Frank hesitated for 2 seconds. "No need, I'll sleep on the floor." "That won't do," I firmly rejected him. "The floor is too cold, you might catch a cold, and besides." I raised the iPad in my hand. "The horror movie isn't finished yet, so stay with me and watch." With a persuasive tone, I continued, "Frank, you're not scared, are you? If you're not afraid, then watch with me for a while." No matter how innocent he was still a boy. Being provoked by me on the spot, Frank reluctantly agreed. "Okay, then." However, he glanced at the terrifying face of the female ghost on the iPad screen and tightly pursed his lips. Without further ado, I pulled him onto the bed. "Get on the bed, we'll turn off the lights and watch the horror movie." Saying that, I used the remote to turn off the lights, and sat side by side with Frank on the bed. I secured the iPad and adjusted the movie progress to the beginning, starting from the very start. Starting off with scary parts isn't as interesting, and besides, the beginning of this horror movie had a passionate kissing scene, and it would be a waste to watch it without Frank. As expected, I rewound the progress bar to 0, and within the first 2 minutes, the screen displayed a couple engaged in a secret affair, with a passionate display of affection. The actors in front of us were kissing passionately, and I silently turned my head to look at Frank, licking my lips. Chapter 5. Frank seemed tense, his body stiff as he stared at the screen, his Adam's apple quietly bobbing. "Frank, tell me, is this interesting?" I intentionally teased him, emboldened by the alcohol and becoming more daring in my words. "What?" Frank seemed somewhat surprised, pausing for a moment before pretending to be clueless, his voice instantly becoming hoarse. I leaned closer to his side. "Is what they're doing interesting? Should we try it too?" Frank seemed completely taken aback. Forget I said anything." He stuttered for a moment, his gaze avoiding mine and landing on the screen. Seeing how he was reacting, I snorted and disregarded everything, grabbing Frank's head and leaning in to kiss him. Frank's body stiffened, but he didn't move. To be honest, I was just talking big and I had never even had my first kiss. With no real experience, how would I know how to kiss? And with Frank not responding, I had to muster up the courage for the next step. I tentatively used my tongue to part his lips. His lips were so soft, our lips and tongues touching, and the sensation made me tremble uncontrollably. Chapter 6. However, just as I discreetly tried to unbutton his pajamas, he stopped my hand. Frank ended the kiss, his voice slightly hoarse. "That's enough kissing, let's watch the movie." With that, he turned his head to look at the screen. I was stunned. Is that it? We passionately kissed, and it just ended so lightly like that? I felt unsatisfied, but I composed myself and silently shifted my gaze back to the screen. Well, we were in the dark with a horror movie playing, and here I was, a teenage girl in a camisole nightgown, sitting next to him. Was it difficult to make a move on him? Was it? So, I pretended to be nonchalant and turned my head to watch the screen with him. Luckily, the movie progressed quite quickly. Not long into the beginning, the female ghost appeared. With eerie background music playing, the ghost suddenly appeared, and before Frank could react, I let out a startled cry and grabbed his arm, pulling it around me as I buried my head in his chest. Clutching his waist tightly with both hands, I whispered, "Frank, I'm so scared." As I spoke, I held onto him even tighter. Most importantly, I knew Frank could definitely feel the warmth of my 36's right now. Chapter 7. Indeed. Frank remained stiff, not moving, and his breathing became more rapid. After a brief pause, he gently patted my back and reassured me in a soft voice, "Don't be afraid, horror movies are all fake." I didn't let go, maintaining the same position as before. I looked up at him. "But you were scared to death just now." Frank fell silent for a moment. It's easier to advise others than to advise oneself. His reasoning was quite far-fetched. Of course, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the ghost in the movie started causing mischief again. In the dimly lit room, the background music playing through the speakers did create a creepy atmosphere. I took the opportunity to hold on to him even tighter. Oh my, it's so scary. However, Frank didn't react much. Gathering my courage, I rubbed against him with more force, and the result. Breaking news, ladies. Who would have known that his pajama button was so loose? I ended up smashing my head right into it. My face happened to bury itself in his abs, which was incredibly embarrassing. Frank appeared tall and slim, yet he surprisingly had abs. And not just one. Chapter 8. This position is a bit awkward, but having my face buried in his abs was such a novel and thrilling experience. I hesitated for a moment but maintained the position without moving. In hindsight, I should be grateful that Frank was clean and didn't have any unpleasant odors. On the contrary, there was a faint scent of men's shower gel. After a few seconds, Frank pulled me away forcefully. He almost gritted his teeth and said, "Have you seen enough?" I pouted, feeling a bit unjustified. "It's pitch black in there, what can you see?" Frank fell silent for a moment, then resumed the movie and whispered, "Let's watch the movie." Here we go again. I frowned and glanced at him. This guy really wanted to play the role of the virtuous one till the end. After a few more back and forth struggles, I finally felt a bit deflated. Plus, the alcohol was starting to wear off, so I sighed and let go of Frank's shirt that I was clutching onto. Oh well, let's watch the movie. It's not easy to seduce a male roommate. However, when the female ghost jumped out again and started bouncing around in the pitch-black room, Frank suddenly flipped over and pounced on me. He placed both hands on either side of my head, and in the darkness, I could see his eyes. Deep and bright. I suddenly felt a bit nervous. What? What are you doing? Frank silently looked at me, and when he spoke, his voice was noticeably hoarse. I saw the female ghost and got a little scared. Frank shifted his right hand, which was initially propping up the bed, and gently caressed my face. He asked in a low voice, "So, will this help alleviate the fear?" With those words, he kissed me in the darkness. Like dry tinder meeting a roaring fire, this kiss became a spark that couldn't be contained. With eerie music as the backdrop, the experience between Frank and me was far from ordinary. In the dimly lit room, I nestled in his embrace, tightly holding onto his arm. "Frank, are you really scared of horror movies?" Frank smiled, his voice gentle and pleasing. "Guess. I guess he was pretending." After planning and preparing for months, trying to win him over, and all. He had been playing dumb this whole time? Chapter 9. In the early morning, I was awakened by Frank's kiss. His kisses landed delicately on the corners of my eyebrows and eyes, tickling me. I opened my eyes and met his smiling gaze. In an instant, my mind was flooded with memories of last night, like the intimate moments between Frank and me, and our madness amidst the eerie background music. Last night, Frank seemed completely different from his usual self. There was a hint of restraint, a touch of indulgence, and a tinge of madness. In reality, these combinations seemed contradictory, but that's how Frank made me feel. In moments of passion, he held me gently and whispered in my ear, "Nan." Yes. Even now, I remember his eyes glowing red in the darkness. He said, "We're finally together." Honestly, even now that I'm sober, I can't quite comprehend the depth of his words. We haven't really gone through any thrilling or dramatic experiences between us. At most, we played games and teased each other for a while. So why did he say, "finally," with such seriousness? But despite my boldness last night, with the short skirt and the teasing, now that I'm sober, I feel a bit timid. Especially when I meet Frank's gaze. He didn't say anything, just smiled and looked at me quietly. My face turned red, my heart raced, and I couldn't find the words to say. Chapter 10. Frank had already gotten dressed at some point and was now standing by the bed. "Awake," he said. It was the first thing he said to me. I nodded, quietly lifting the covers for a quick glance and blushing deeply. In that brief moment, the ambiguous marks of our passionate night were evident on my skin. He half squatted by the bed, reached his hand into the covers, and entwined his fingers with mine. "Can I take you home?" he asked. Home. Things were progressing a bit too quickly. I couldn't quite grasp the situation and asked him softly, "Isn't this too fast?" "Not fast," he whispered with a smile. "I've been waiting for a long time." I was taken aback for a moment, then a sweet feeling welled up in my heart. "Tell me honestly, have you secretly liked me for a long time?" I asked. Frank paused for a moment, then chuckled softly. "Yes." He tightened his grip on my hand. "For a very, very long time." My heart raced as my longtime crush suddenly became so proactive. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Fortunately, he didn't do anything to make me blush further. He simply said, "It's about time. Today happens to be a weekend. Let's tidy up and go home together." Huh? The speed of it all made it hard for me to believe. But when I thought about it, I had been longing for him for so long. It should make me happy that Frank was taking the initiative. Going home was going home. It was the perfect opportunity. If I can take it a step further and make it official, then I'll have completely captured this godlike boy. So, I gritted my teeth and agreed happily. But when I was about to get dressed, he didn't even turn his head. "Frank," I blushed, "I need to get dressed." He responded gently, a hint of laughter in his eyes. "Do you need my help?" My face grew even hotter. "No, but could you turn around?" Frank leaned forward slightly, smiling as he looked at me. "Why be shy?" I saw everything last night. He had changed. I never could have imagined that he would be this kind of Frank. My face was burning. I covered it with both hands, trying to cool down. However, Frank pulled my hands away and said something inexplicable. "Nan, you and we've finally become us." It was a cheesy and old-fashioned line, but Frank said it with utmost sincerity. After saying that, he smiled and didn't trouble me any further. He stood up on his own and turned away from me. I let out a sigh of relief and quickly changed my clothes. Chapter 11. When meeting the parents, it's important to be formal. I finally settled on a light blue dress and applied light makeup. After I finished getting ready, Frank had already prepared a meal and was waiting for me. It was just a simple home-cooked meal, but it looked appetizing. Moreover, Frank had made a few dishes that were my favorites. 2 dishes and a soup, braised eggplant, garlic stir-fried water spinach, and tomato egg drop soup. These 2 dishes and a soup were my all-time favorites since I was a child. They were the kind of dishes that I never got tired of no matter how many times I had them. But this seemed to be the first time I was eating a meal cooked by Frank, and inexplicably, I felt like crying. Though, I didn't even know where this sudden wave of sadness came from. Halfway through the meal, I unintentionally looked up. And Frank's eyes were also a little teary. We locked eyes and couldn't help but burst into laughter. It was strange how something as simple as having a regular breakfast could evoke such a bittersweet feeling. Although, this breakfast of 2 dishes and a soup was indeed extraordinary. Chapter 12. We finished breakfast in this peculiar atmosphere. After a quick tidy-up, Frank took me out. The distance wasn't too far, so we decided not to take a taxi. Instead, Frank insisted on holding my hand as we walked. I jokingly called him stingy, saying he didn't want to spend money on me. He smiled and replied, "Then how about you support me?" Sure, I immediately agreed, playing along. Big sister has money, how about sponsoring you? It was meant as a joke, but Frank seemed taken aback for a moment. After a brief pause, he softly said, "Okay," with a glimmer of light in his eyes that I couldn't quite understand. Then, hand in hand, we walked to a nearby park. Frank stood at the park entrance for a while before turning to me and asking, "Shall we go in for a walk?" I checked the time and realized we still had enough time, so I nodded in agreement. After all, it was our first date, and strolling hand in hand in the park felt quite romantic. With his hand holding mine, Frank led me into the park, but his fingertips seemed to tremble slightly. We walked together, fingers intertwined, taking turns in exploring the park until we reached its deepest part. It was quiet and secluded here, with hardly anyone in sight. He held my hand and stood in front of a wall, gazing silently. "What are you looking at?" I asked curiously. He shook his head, smiled softly, and with a gentle expression, seemed lost in memories. "Nothing, I just suddenly remembered that this used to be a patch of grass a long time ago." As Frank spoke, a rumor crossed my mind, and I shuddered involuntarily. "Let's go." I suddenly remembered a news story from decades ago about a boy who took drugs and committed suicide here. With that, I pulled Frank away. Quietly following behind me, Frank remained silent. It wasn't until we were almost back at the park entrance that he spoke softly, "It's okay, even if there are ghosts in this world, they won't harm you." "Why?" I turned to look at him, expecting him to say something like, "Because you're beautiful," to cheer me up. But he just smiled and said softly, "Because someone who chooses a corner that doesn't affect anyone even for suicide must be a gentle person." Frank's words unexpectedly touched me, and I no longer felt scared. It somehow made sense. Someone who chooses a place for suicide that wouldn't inconvenience anyone, even in death, shouldn't be an evil spirit. Thinking about it this way, I truly didn't feel afraid anymore, and my pace slowed down. Frank held my hand and gently surveyed the scenery in the park. He said, "Actually, I really wanted to bring you to this park, hand in hand. I wanted to show you how beautiful it is here, but I was afraid. Afraid that you wouldn't be able to handle it in the future." To be honest, I didn't fully understand what Frank meant by that statement. "If you wanted to bring me here, then let's come. What's there to accept or not?" I said, giving his face a pinch. "Frank, did you exhaust yourself too much last night? You seem a bit off today." He laughed, with a fleeting touch of emotion in his eyes, and surprisingly made a joke, "Well, after secretly loving you for so long, I finally succeeded last night. Of course, I'm a bit excited on our first date." Chapter 13. After leaving the park, we went together to a nearby shopping mall to buy gifts. As time was tight, we decided to take a taxi to his house. Frank's house was in a mid-range residential area on the 7th floor. As we knocked on the door, I inexplicably felt a bit nervous and instinctively tightened my grip on Frank's hand. Frank held my hand back and comfortingly chuckled, "Don't worry, my mom is easy to get along with, and I've already shown her your photos, and she really likes you." "Really?" Frank nodded. Before I could ask more, the door opened. Inside stood a middle-aged woman, well-maintained, with barely any fine lines around her eyes. She was wearing a deep red dress, exuding a certain charm with her every move. I couldn't help but freeze, partly because I had never expected my future mother-in-law to be this attractive. A person in their 50s could still be so stunning. But it was also because I didn't know why, but it felt like I had seen her somewhere before. Especially when she smiled at me. Auntie warmly welcomed me into the house and then turned to shout towards the kitchen, "Honey, come out quickly, our daughter-in-law is here." The word daughter-in-law instantly made my face turn red. Soon, a middle-aged man rushed out of the kitchen, still wearing an apron around his waist, and smiled, nodding at me in greeting. This was Frank's dad, handsome and refined, with Frank inheriting his looks. Both father and son were equally attractive. Feeling a bit embarrassed, I intended to go to the kitchen to help, but Frank's mom pulled me to sit down on the sofa. "Don't worry about it. We have a household rule that all the housework is done by the men. When you and Frank get married, leave the cooking and vegetable washing to him." Frank's dad stood by, smiling, without any objections, just softly sighing, "I owe you from a past life." Saying that, he turned to look at Frank, "In the future, learn from your old man and take good care of your wife, remember?" Frank nodded, his expression gentle. I also owe her from a past life. Honestly, this whole family was a bit cheesy, but it was also exceptionally warm. Frank's family atmosphere was truly wonderful, and it was evident that his parents were deeply in love. Although they weren't extremely wealthy, their home was filled with warmth and harmony. Frank's mom seemed like a woman who had been cherished for many years, with fair and tender hands, devoid of any scent of cooking oil, but rather carrying a faint fragrance. No wonder, growing up in such an environment, Frank turned out to be so gentle. Chapter 14. During my conversation with Frank's mom, I also learned her name, Yvonne. It sounded beautiful. It was evident that she and Frank's dad were deeply in love. Frank's dad indeed spoiled her, without any limits. However, he would pretend to be helpless and sigh, saying, "Maybe I owe her from a past life." As we sat around the dining table, I secretly observed Frank's mom sitting across from me. Truly, those who are loved have brightness in their eyes. While I was quietly watching, 2 peeled prawns suddenly appeared in my bowl. I looked up to see Frank's gentle smile. "Eat more. My dad is a great cook." I nodded and obediently took a bite of the shrimp, feeling a sense of awe. Who would have thought that today was our first day together with Frank, yet it felt like we had been together for years. There was no initial awkwardness or shyness of a new relationship. We had an exceptional familiarity and understanding, both in our daily lives and last night's intimate moments. It was strange. After lunch, Frank and his dad went to the kitchen to wash the dishes together, while his mom sat me down on the sofa for a chat. She handed me a peeled apple and said, "Nan, Auntie can tell that Frank really likes you." I thanked her as I accepted the apple but didn't know how to respond. She chuckled softly, glanced at the father and son washing dishes in the kitchen, and said, "Frank has always been different from other children since he was young. He seems mature and responsible, but he also has trouble fitting in with his peers. Many girls pursued him over the years, but he never glanced at any of them. Sometimes, I get a feeling. A feeling that he's waiting for someone." Honestly, Auntie used to worry that his pickiness would prevent him from finding the right partner in the future. Thankfully, you came along. She started peeling an orange, saying, "As his mom, no one understands him better than I do. I can see it in his eyes, he truly loves you." I blushed, feeling a mix of shyness and excitement. It's hard not to be moved when you hear the mother of the person you like saying these things. Frank's mom peeled another orange and handed it to me, saying, "Both Frank's dad and I really like you. If Frank ever mistreats you, just let us know, Auntie will definitely stand up for you." I accepted the orange, thanked her with a smile, and before I could say anything else, I saw Frank walking out of the kitchen. He wiped his hands with a tissue and then took my hand, leading me back to his room. As he closed the door, he enveloped me in his arms and said, "Nan, I finally brought you home." After a few seconds of silence, his voice lowered once again, "I finally have a home." I don't quite understand what his last sentence means, so I can only gently hug him back. "Frank, why are you being so clingy today?" He chuckled, "First time in love, can't help it." Saying that, he straightened up and took me on a tour of his room. Frank's room was very tidy, with a faint scent of incense, and everything was neatly arranged, which was his usual style. There was a large bookshelf in the room, filled with all kinds of books. I walked over to take a look and casually asked, "Frank, did any girls write love letters or letters to you back when you were in school? Show me, please." However, Frank froze. After a few seconds of silence, he gently averted his gaze. "No, I don't like letters." "Don't like letters?"
Yeah.
Frank lowered his gaze, looking at the floor, his voice soft. "I always feel like letters have a touch of sadness to them." He walked over and hugged me again. "Nan, I won't write you any more letters, okay?" He gently stroked my hair. "You might not understand these words, and you don't need to. Just know that I love you very much." I looked up at him, teasing a little, "How much do you love me?" "Very much, in a way you can't imagine." He answered without hesitation, but there was still a slight greasiness to it. I persisted, "How much is very much?" This time, Frank didn't answer. He locked the door behind us and then undid a button on his collar. My heart sank, and I instinctively took a step back. "Frank, we're in your house."
Yeah.
Frank pulled me onto the bed, his movements gentle. His kisses landed softly, tickling my earlobes. "This is more exciting, isn't it?" Frank had changed. I wanted to refuse, but his kisses came at just the right moment. Oh, I couldn't resist his body. I couldn't refuse. So, amidst my trembling heart, we explored love in his bedroom. In the heat of the moment, I buried my face in his chest and asked in a muffled voice, "Frank, do you think we'll be together in the next life?" He seemed taken aback for a moment, then chuckled softly. Warm kisses landed on the corners of my eyes and eyebrows. "In the previous life, you asked me the same thing."